Erin, you suggested that we watch this. You mentioned it being a movie that promotes a culture of life, I think was your phrase. And so, I kind of expected, okay, there's going to be something somewhat edifying, but I didn't really expect it to be as profound as it actually was. And it is a quite surprisingly profound film.
This is Criteria. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. I'm James Majewski, here with my co-host, Thomas V. Miras. Hey, Thomas.
Hello.
And today we're talking about sort of an offbeat film, maybe a little lowbrow, different than our usual material. We're talking about Godzilla! Godzilla Minus One, minus color, in fact, actually. So this is the most recent Godzilla film. Was released December 1st, 2023. Ended its theatrical run just recently, yesterday, actually, as we record this. But right at the end of its theatrical run, they released a black and white cut for like 5 days, and we got to go see that on the recommendation of a good friend of ours, who also happens to be joining us for this podcast. I will go ahead and introduce her now. Her name is Erin McAtee. She is an incredible visual artist, but also the executive director and one of two co-founding members of the Catholic artist collective Art House 2B, of which I also happen to be a part. Erin, welcome to Criteria.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes.
You guys appeared together on Godsplaining recently, I should mention.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. We did indeed. Erin, do you want to tell our listeners about that episode of Godsplaining?
Yeah, so in this episode, two Dominican priests, Father Bonaventure and Father Gregory, interviewed us about why art, basically. So James and I just answered some questions about that and talked a little bit about Art House 2B and what we're up to here in New York City. So
maybe would you want to just say a word about Art House 2B and what we're up to here in New York City?
Yeah, so Art House has been around for 3.5 years now, since summer of 2020, and we've been doing programming and community building and creating events that are both spiritually nourishing as well as addressing the hospitality needs of artists and patrons alike, and uplifting artwork from artists across the spectrum of beginner to established in their careers. And so our vision statement is to renew the culture through renewing the heart of the artist. So that's at the heart of everything that we do.
If anybody wants to hear more about Erin's artistic bona fides, and mine as well, you can go ahead and listen to that Godsplaining episode. I think we'll link to it in the description, because you're definitely not going to get it here, all right? We're talking about beer and pretzels type fare. In fact, we are drinking a couple of beers right now,
yes,
to signal to you, the viewer, that this is decidedly, lowbrow. We're talking about Godzilla, a monster movie, all right? But actually, let me give a quick synopsis. And I don't know why I never thought of doing this before, but all I did was put in Godzilla into Google, and it gave me a synopsis. I
think it's like cheating if we just read a synopsis.
No, it's great. We've spent so much time struggling to synopsize these films. When I can just say, Japan has barely recovered from the Second World War when a gigantic peril emerges off the coast of Tokyo. Koichi, a deserter traumatized by his first confrontation with Godzilla, sees this as an opportunity to redeem his conduct during the war. That's the Google. The Google. It's was released in 2023. I already mentioned, but directed by Takashi Yamazaki, and yes, its normal format is in color, but we got to see this black and white one, in part because we, in preparation for talking about this, also watched the original 1954 Godzilla. So even though I don't think we'll be talking about that one mainly, we can just sort of throw it in to elevate our, it's on the Criterion channel. It's an important film.
Yeah. I watched it last night as well, actually, and I have some thoughts.
Oh, nice.
So anyway.
Nice.
But Erin, you were we were talking about having you on the podcast for a while, and I just kept saying, well, pick a film, just give us some suggestions. And to my surprise, your suggestion was a Godzilla movie. That is something I wouldn't have seen coming. And so, yeah, why, how did you end up seeing this? Because is this your normal viewing fare?
It's not, but I have had two friends who were thinking about seeing it a couple weeks ago, and I watched the trailer with them. Were very hype about it, and I was like, oh, Godzilla, like, what, this is so, I don't know, like, I just was kind of turned off at first, but then saw the trailer, and I was like, oh, there's something deeper about this. Like, this is not just the director seeing dollar signs trying to make money kind of thing, which is what I was initially thinking about it, just taking advantage of this kind of enterprise that's been around for so long. But I could just sense from the way that the trailer rolled out that, like, oh, this is something I should see.
And I will say, I haven't seen the movie in color, so I can't compare it. But I thought it looked awesome in black and white, and I'm sort of glad that nobody told me to go see this movie earlier, so that I ended up seeing the black and white version.
Right. Yeah. I actually, when I was looking into it, the director was very careful. He said we can do the black and white version, but it can't just be like a filter that gets thrown over everything. Right. They went through shot by shot and basically recolored it. Right, like with Mad Max. Yes, right. Yeah. So I don't think they had a ton of time to do that, so they might have done a better job if they had shot it from the beginning as a black and white film. But for what it is, it looked great. And I did go back and watch the colorized trailer. Okay. And I gotta say, I think that this film is really well served by the black and white. I think the black and white really helps to smooth the visual effects and sort of make them more cohesive with the surroundings. Right, because I haven't seen a movie in black and white that had this many visual effects. Right. Or obvious visual effects. And, Mad Max Fury Road famously doesn't use a lot of visual effects. Right. So it's a fantastical movie, but it's not a VFX laden film. So I see what you mean about it smoothing it out. But what is interesting too is that this film similarly actually is not completely covered in visual effects. I think I saw a number that said that it only used 610 visual effects shots. Apparently that number is much higher in your typical, sort of summer blockbuster fare or something. Okay. Certainly a typical monster movie. And the impression I got was that there was a lot of practical effects being used. Obviously not for, Godzilla himself, but, there's a lot of shots, for instance, out on the water. And we've got actors, occupying real, geometry, real ships, leaning over, the starboard or there's a tactility to the sets that it's clearly not a green screen that they're on, you know what I mean? So what I'm saying is that I think that for a Godzilla film, it's already exercising a certain amount of restraint in its use of visual effects. Yeah. But then you put the black and white on top of that, and it does a very good job of uniting the visual effects to the world around it so that everything feels very real and very tactile. But also black and white just has this this drama that it conveys, this dramatic and poetic drama that is kind of effortless. There were some shots in the trailer that I remember seeing them in black and white and being struck by them in black and white in a way that I was not in the color. For instance, the scene when Noriko, who is sort of the love interest of this film, of Koichi, the main character, she's looking out the train when she first sees Godzilla. And that shot, you just see her framed by the window of the subway car. And in black and white, it looks very nice. It's a nice composition, and there's something about the hues of the train against her face. but then in color, it kind of lost some of that poetry. So I don't know how to account for it very much, but I think it is worth just noting that black and white is still a relevant aesthetic choice, for some reason. I don't know. Did you have any thoughts about it, Erin?
No, I agree with everything you're saying. I think having seen now the old Godzilla, the original from 1954, and then seeing this new one in black and white, there were some interesting kind of overlaps. And I think like one is obviously, closer to the context of the World War and all of that. And there's kind of this quality to the film that's obviously like a little lower or whatever than how they're doing black and white in 2023. But I would agree there was something about kind of the values and the light and dark. Like when something is just in chiaroscuro, so like that dark to light, that word's often used a lot in art, kind of art terminology to describe something like a drawing, like a charcoal drawing that has like a lot of value and that is depicting like these whites and gray tones and darks. You kind of get this clear sense of what's going on, or like a more dramatic impact, and you can see things a little bit more clearly sometimes in that lens, looking at like a drawing that's done in charcoal, for example, versus a drawing that's done in like a million colors.
Right.
Both are beautiful in different ways, but in one there is like the artist is making a choice to draw the viewer into like something very core, or something that's it's kind of like taking back all of the extras so that you really just get like kind of the boiled down beauty of like the shadows and light and dark and whatever the subject is. So that's what my initial reaction would be about the black and white versus
I think that tracks because, certainly color is a tool in the hands of the artist and it conveys information. So there's storytelling that can take place in the use of color in film. And in fact, when I saw this trailer, there was like a scene of people fleeing from Godzilla, and then there's a little girl running through the crowd and she's in a bright red dress. And so there's information and a story being told that is lost in the black and white version, right? But when you lose that information, there is then less getting in the way of other things being conveyed, right? And so maybe this red dress is not very central to.
What if they had just kept the red dress red, like in the black and white version, in like a blatant Schindler's List ripoff that would just been like enrage the critics?
I also just really appreciated the art direction as a whole on this, because it felt so of the time period. We've seen films before that have tried to do, World War II, or, different period pieces, but then maybe rely over much on CGI and visual effects such that, like, I don't know, there's just something that kind of feels a little anachronistic in that. But here, there was something even about the art direction itself in the sort of construction of the uniforms and the ship locales, and then also some of the scientific instruments that they were using that felt all very, very sort of a piece with the Godzilla movie that we had watched the night before from 1954, and even down to the performances and choices that these Japanese actors were making just still felt very...
And that was very deliberate from what I read in terms of the casting and the direction of the actors to really go with these like Showa era, like that period of Japanese history, those kind of mannerisms and that kind of way of acting.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, because that totally
there's a
came
real
through.
continuity with older films that we've seen in terms of a lot of those things, even like just cadence of voice and different things.
Right.
I don't want to bury the lead though.
I know. I've gotten too excited talking about these artistic elements.
I don't want to bury the lead because, when Erin, you suggested that we watch this. You mentioned it being a movie that promotes a culture of life, I think was your phrase. And so, I kind of expected, okay, there's going to be something somewhat edifying, but I didn't really expect it to be as profound as it actually was. And it is a quite surprisingly profound film. And if you look at the original Godzilla, it's dealing with ideas, and a lot of it is about kind of the idea of nuclear experimentation or scientific experimentation. Should you use it? Shouldn't you use it? Things that are potentially have dangerous uses. And of course, Godzilla is awoken in both films very explicitly in the original film and implicitly in this film, I would say, by nuclear testing in the Pacific. But that film, it deals with that in a more kind of the original film deals with it in a more kind of a broad way. And also, the characters in the film are maybe a little more, government people, scientists, whereas in this film, it gets a lot more personal and a lot more common man like, because the main character is just an ordinary kamikaze pilot who chickened out, so to speak, in doing his duty. And before his mission, he pretended that his plane was mechanically faulty and needed to be repaired. So he got out of doing a suicide bombing, and he's suffering guilt from this throughout the movie, as well as the trauma of the war and the deaths of all these people that he cared about, whether it's his fellow soldiers or the mechanics or his family being killed. And he has this survivor's guilt, which is amplified by his own, what he feels as cowardice. But at the very beginning of the film, we're told right away that another soldier sympathizes with him, because he says, what's the point of throwing your life away when it's not going to make a difference? Meaning, they've already pretty much lost the war by this point. So what is the point of dying just for the sake of dying? And that's sort of a question that recurs throughout the movie and choices that this character has to make. And yet the cultural expectation that the best thing he could do is die for his country, even if it's pointless, is so deep that he's just really saddled with this horrible guilt throughout the film. And so when we talk about what, a culture of life might look like in this, a culture of death might look like in our country, is different in some ways, I think, than what a culture of death might look like in, pre-World War II Japan, or in, ancient Sparta or something, where we don't have so much a culture of death that focuses on self-sacrifice, right? And in those countries, those highly nationalistic, collectivistic cultures, they did have that notion, but it's twisted and it becomes kind of a death cult, because it's all about war. And what amazes me about this movie, especially because, not just knowing about, Japan pre-World War II, pre-modernized Japan, but also just knowing about Japan now with its high rates of, depression and suicide and stuff, it is remarkable to have a film that sort of gave me some hope for the Japanese people, actually, that they could come up with something this beautiful and profound, and that deals with these themes not just in a broad way, but in a way that's like very specific to their own history and their own pathologies, and deals with it in such an honest and maybe even uncomfortable way. Certainly it would have been uncomfortable to deal with some of this stuff about, suicide bombing and stuff like that at the time when the original Godzilla was made, which is maybe why, that movie doesn't deal with those aspects of the war experience so much, or the experience of defeat so much. I'm going on a lot, but there's just a lot here.
Yeah.
That's very beautiful, very profound and thought-provoking, but it's also such a creative, and results in something very artistically interesting that could only deal with these themes in this way, in this cultural context,
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing all of that, Thomas. I think that's a really helpful context to kind of give everyone. But yeah, it's so true. Like, looking at this movie, I was very kind of surprised at how much this sort of like this thread of like suicide and this kind of death cult feeling within like Japanese culture, how much that was a part of it, because I hadn't seen the original Godzilla yet, where there is like the suicide, or like kind of man that risks his life at the end, in a similar way that a kamikaze pilot would. But it's just so interesting to me that there's this real redemption that happens within Godzilla Minus One, where all of that, it's like very raw. It's all given to us that like this culture and these different people are like pressuring him, guilting him for having not lost his life in the war, for having backed out, being a coward, like you deserve to die, these kinds of things. And you can tell how he's like really grappling with it throughout the whole film. But then, and I don't know if we're spoiling it, I guess this is kind of what this podcast is for, is to kind of flesh out the whole movie. But this choice at the end, this kind of conversion of heart that the main character has, and that like the people around him all collectively have in their vision of like death and life and the dignity of human life, and that like there is this decision that like no, like life, I should keep my life, like it's okay to like to be transformed in this way, even though it's countercultural for like my people and like where I live, kind of like what's been ingrained in the Japanese people up to that point. I have more thoughts, but maybe there's other things that we want to bring up.
Also, too, just to really quickly tag on that, like there's a big point made of this anti-Godzilla effort being a civilian-led effort, even though many of the people are former soldiers, and also of it being a wholly voluntary thing, as opposed to you're coerced, you're drafted, it's decided that you're going to be a suicide bomber, and you don't have any say in that, and that also is kind of, it's reclaiming. What I like about it is like when they say, we can live, we should be dying not for its own sake, just for heroic death, but living for the future. They're not rejecting the idea of risking your life, but what they're saying is that like we shouldn't treat life so cheaply. We should try to carry out a military operation in such a way that minimizes the chance of us dying while maximizing the chance of victory. So it's not that they say, let's all become pacifists, but it's just that everything that's noble in what had gone before is sort of reclaimed and purified in that it's properly ordered,
Yeah, and you can see the film draws attention to this as they're getting ready for this final mission to defeat Godzilla. One of the commanders remarks, look at them, they're beaming. That there's this joy in the sacrifice that all of them are willing to make right now and putting themselves on the line, even in the face of, horrific danger, that they know what they're doing this for, and that there's a nobility in it, that and so they're able to be joyful in that sacrifice. I was amazed by this film. I mean, I was sobbing at the end. Like that was not something that I would have expected from a Godzilla movie.
Right.
Now part of the genius of Godzilla has always been its capacity to sort of include a kind of commentary on on evil and on sort of social ills. So yeah, we've mentioned that the first Godzilla, it comes out of this post-war context, 1954, 10 years after the atomic bomb. The central, what was so interesting about that first Godzilla film was that it spent as much, if not more time with its characters and with people than it did with this actual monster that the whole movie is about.
Mm-hmm.
So that first Godzilla film has this really nice rhythm where there are these moments of, yes, terror and destruction and this like incredible visual effects for the time of this, man in a Godzilla suit going through and destroying things. But then there's like this ebb and flow where then we go to the human story, which is the human devastation that is wrought, in the wake of this monster, which really is sort of like a stand-in for the human devastation wrought by war. And you can look at Godzilla, that first film in 1954, as kind of a sort of a post-traumatic processing that's happening at the level of popular culture, in sort of looking at images of destroyed cities, bodies, lined up, kind of looking at these images that are basically indistinguishable from images coming out of the war and beginning to confront them. And then also, interestingly, confronting the idea, the ethical dilemma of using a weapon of mass destruction.
Mhm.
So like the central sort of problem in that first Godzilla film is should we use this weapon of mass destruction, the oxygen destroyer, to defeat Godzilla? And this is a problem because the scientist who has developed the oxygen destroyer doesn't want, humanity to have another terrible weapon in its arsenal. But it's this problem that not just that scientist grapples with, but really the whole community and all the characters that we see in the film. And it's like Japan, at the level of its popular culture, is sort of proposing this problem to itself as the victim of
Right.
a weapon of mass destruction.
Which is fascinating. Yeah.
It's almost like they're trying to psychologize and understand, perhaps even sympathize with the position of having to ask yourself that question, like, is this worth the human cost, the potential human cost? Now, obviously, the analogy isn't perfect. Like, they're using this weapon against Godzilla. They're not using it against like cities of innocent people.
Right.
Right. So we're not drawing like a moral equivalency here.
But it's fascinating that you've got you've got a culture that a country that is so thoroughly defeated and humiliated that it has no choice but to try to understand its conquerors.
Right.
It's not going to say, okay, in 10 years we're going to come back on this and we'll win this time. Where they're so thoroughly defeated that's like they just have to have a whole change in mindset.
Right.
Because I don't think that the military, imperial government of Japan during World War II would have, probably, had too many scruples about using those kinds of weapons based on, the war crimes that were committed and things like that.
But, just to bring it back to my initial point is that this is kind of the genius of Godzilla and has been from the beginning is how this dragon, he's basically the dragon archetype, is useful as a storytelling device to help clarify the dragons, the demons that we wrestle with, really. And if in the first film, it's sort of happening at this very sort of generalized level, this sort of societal level, this film now, 70 years later, it's worth noting that 2024 marks the 70th anniversary of Godzilla. This one is much more personal and cuts much more to like the heart of the matter because it's addressing a kind of nihilism that one can see as the kind of spiritual result of the devastations of the 20th century, and in particular World War II. So it's continuing this legacy in more ways than one. We talked about the artistic sort of legacy and continuity, but there's also this thematic deepening that's taking place. And it was so profound because in addition to being, very pro-life, it's also pro-family. It sort of posits as like this thing worth fighting for, the love that this man has for the woman who will become his wife and this child that they've both effectively adopted, and the beauty of that family unit and his inability to accept that from the beginning of the film. It's a process that he has to go through in dealing with his own demons, his own dragons.
Yeah.
Before he can give his full-throated yes to that.
But what's cool is that, like, any number of films we could point to are like, yeah, he's fighting for his family, so that's pro-life. But it would be very broad. In this film, again, like what you just pointed to, the dynamics are so specific to the characters. They're specific to the culture. There's specific problems. It's not this simplistic issue. Yes, he would defend them, but it's not that he has to decide to defend them so much as he has to decide to be vulnerable to them.
Yes.
Like he would be on board with defending them from the beginning. We see him working and providing for them, but it's it's not only the external role, but it's also the internal family dynamic that is being looked at, and the challenges and the conquering of those problems as well.
Right. And having to let go of his shame that's coming from without in order to be available to his family, you know. But anyway, we've been talking for a long time, Erin. I want to give you a chance to jump in on this if you had any additional thoughts.
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting that, like for me, as I was watching this whole sort of pseudo family, adopted family dynamic play out, I mean, it was very clear to me that from the start, Koichi is this essentially Saint Joseph type of figure who is really thrown into this situation. This young woman who's kind of a vagabond, like we get the sense that she's dirty and maybe whatever, like that she has this little baby and she's running through the market, she's stolen food and she's being chased, and so she just throws the baby into Koichi's hands. And then she runs away. And then eventually they end up meeting, and he gives her back the baby. And then he ends up taking her in for a little bit, but very reluctantly. And then they end up staying.
And the baby's not even hers either.
The baby's not even hers. Yeah, it was given to her by a mother who was dying after the, destruction of the war. And so there is this sort of like pieced together kind of family situation happening that was, to me, very symbolic of the Holy Family. And just kind of the poverty too that they're experiencing, and that Saint Joseph kind of figure who is really wrestling with this, like, this is not my wife, this is not my baby, like, I don't know, like, I don't want to do this.
Perhaps a feeling of unworthiness,
Yeah, and just and also again that like sense of lacking the vulnerability or like desire for intimacy with these two, because he has to fight his own war. Like she says that later in the movie, like, have you finished fighting your own war yet? Before fighting the larger Godzilla kind of war. And it's just beautiful to me how throughout the film it's like you can see that he still like has this wall up. He's still dealing with his own stuff and just kind of sees her and the child as like people that he's protecting and living with, and and it's cool, but they're not like a true family unit. Like he tells the daughter at some point, she calls him daddy, and he says, "I'm not your daddy." And and his friends are there, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, how could you say that?" La la la. Like it's clear that the conversion of heart still hasn't happened for this guy yet, to like really enter in wholeheartedly into this situation and like lay down his life. And you kind of see the conversion happen once Noriko, the woman, when she ends up like sacrificing her life, or so we think, she ends up like pushing him out of the way, and we think that she's dead for most of the rest of the movie. We find out she's alive at the end, but essentially sacrifices herself for him. And then from that point, I think that's when we start to see the transformation happen. We see the daughter give him a crayon drawing of the three of them as a family right before he's about to go. And essentially, we think he's going to go give his life and, kill Godzilla with his sacrifice. And so he essentially, it's like right before he makes this decision to give everything, to like sacrifice for the sake of like the Japanese people, and he decides to keep his life, to save his life, rather than commit suicide essentially through this like death of Godzilla. It's like through all of these things there's like a culmination of a true conversion of heart that happens within him, that I think is like very similar to what we see in the Holy Family narrative, and I think was like a very, I'm sure, I don't know the director's beliefs or background, but for me, that was like a very deeply, like, ordinary Saint Joseph, like, raw depiction. Like, I felt like I was watching a similar thing that, something that probably a lot of men can relate to. We're all suffering from different types of brokenness, but, like, that there has to be that conversion of heart that happens through authentic sacrifice, as well as just like love. Like you get the sense that Noriko and the daughter both like just have this like unabashed kind of love for him, and they are open and vulnerable and kind of like there for him as he's dealing with this stuff, but he's also protecting them. And it's kind of an interesting dynamic happening, but I feel like all of them sort of end up having their own deeper conversions of heart, interiorly, but also through like that experience of the little community of the family dynamic that ends up creating this like heroic virtue at the end kind of moment.
Yeah. It's really fascinating because, you know, he's resistant to to wedding Noriko and adopting this child as his own, and it's not because he's like selfishly protecting his freedom, right? He's still sacrificing himself for them. He's working for them. He's giving her money. He's giving them shelter. You know, he even takes sort of some offense when Noriko goes out and gets a job. He says like what, am I not giving you enough money? He wants to provide for them and to protect them. But you know, when she gets that job, it's really her sort of encouraging his freedom. You know, it's really her saying, okay, I'm going to stand on my own 2 feet, and in so doing sort of highlight that you're not giving yourself to me, you know? We get the impression that she wants him, you know, is much more clearly waiting for him, you know, than anything else. But this is, so the reason I say this is because, you know, I think that like in a typical Western film, a man who doesn't want a child and a wife is probably doing so for selfish reasons. But here, his reasons are because of it's a kind of selfishness, but it's really his shame, and it's a feeling of unworthiness,
Right.
and it's what he alludes to as his war. The war for him is not over, is what he says, and it's because he's haunted by, you know, the choices that he made in the war. This feeling of cowardice, but then also, you know, that he's let other people down, that others have lost their lives because of him, supposedly, rightly or wrongly. And the way that he gets out of it, right? I just want to like break it down a little bit, because I don't really think it is the moment of Noriko's sacrifice where we begin to see the change in him for the positive. There is a change after that, but it's almost like he goes even further into his despair, because after that, it's like all the shots we see of him are like him looking very cold, very stern, kind of downcast. He becomes now like determined to also die, basically. He begins to put into action a plan to, you know, to go through with the kamikaze mission this time. This time, he's going to do it, and he's going to defeat Godzilla, and he's going to redeem himself and to everybody else, you know, and he's going to do it for his family, right? He thinks that Noriko is dead, but he's got her photo with him in the cockpit. You know, he loves this daughter, Akiko. So he's left, you know, all of his money and a note to her for when she wakes up. And he's doing it for them, but it's so twisted, it's so perverted, you know, because really what he needs to do is give himself to them, you know, as a father. And so he's driven by this shame. He's driven by this need to prove himself. And what is it really that changes him? And I would contend that it is receiving forgiveness from the sole other survivor of this first encounter with Godzilla. When at the beginning of the film, he lands his plane on a little airstrip and mechanics are working on his plane. Godzilla appears, everybody dies except for him and one other mechanic. And this mechanic blames him, thinks that he might have been able to do something, fire at him with the ship's guns and fire at Godzilla and maybe prevent the deaths of all these mechanics. And so that becomes very much bound up with the shame that he's already feeling for having abandoned his kamikaze mission initially.
And I think Noriko, in his mind, dying and saving him only just compounds his humiliation. Because
right.
As a man, he's being saved by the person that he
now,
should be sacrificed.
Do I think that she doesn't play a role in his change? No. But how does she play the role? She plays the role by giving herself to him, right? She gives herself, and then she basically stands back, right? It's like she cannot be his savior. She can't save him. She can just give himself and then kind of wait patiently. And he has to receive this forgiveness from Mr. Tochi
It's like
Bawa or something.
Tachibana.
Tachibana.
I forget his name. Yeah,
Tachibana.
Tachibana.
List
He,
up here.
Yeah, he forgives him, not like by explicitly saying like I forgive you, but by installing a ejection seat. Kamikaze planes infamously did not have the option of ejecting. There was no saving yourself. Well, this mechanic who's worked on the plane in Koichi's sort of plan to redeem himself by having this mechanic work on the plane. It has to be this mechanic, who works on this plane that's going to be my death.
Right.
Well, what does he do instead? He installs an ejection seat and tells him about it and tells him to live. And it's like receiving that forgiveness is what sort of clarifies for him what he needs to do. And, maybe he doesn't make up his mind until the last minute. In the film, the drama is still very much present as he's flying this plane toward Godzilla. We don't know what's going to happen, in part because we don't know that there's an ejection option. But it's like it's interesting because Noriko can't save him. It's not for her to put these demons to rest. It's something that's really between him and God. And it's through the experience of mercy. It's through the experience of mercy and forgiveness that he has the change of heart. And so I think, like, for me, that was what was so moving to me, was that I can totally relate as a husband, as a father, to these personal demons, these dragons that are blocking me from, trying to keep me back from giving myself to my family. And I can't save myself from those. I'm powerless to redeem myself. And from like my shame and guilt of the past, and that's what he's haunted by. He's haunted by his past.
Mm-hmm.
What do we all need? We need forgiveness. We need mercy, and that's what saves him and makes him able to be in the present, and then find out that Noriko is actually still alive, and he runs to her, and he's disburdened from the dragons that were holding him back, Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautifully said, James. And I just want to point out that the moral depth really makes for some very dramatically interesting and original scenarios. I mean, and some great tension. So when everybody else involved in this mission has decided they're going to do this in a life affirming spirit, and he's the only one, and they don't even know that he's planning to be a kamikaze pilot, he's the only one who's still on that old way of thinking at this point. And so that's some great dramatic tension. And then the fact that in many films, if the hero is sacrificing himself and then it turns out he's still alive at the end, you might think, oh, that's a cop-out, to make the audience feel better or whatever. But in this, what's really cool about it is that the choice to survive is like the hero dying to himself.
Yes.
So it's still like a sacrifice of something in himself.
Yes.
And it's to live. So it's actually the difficult thing for him is it more than being so enraged at Godzilla that he's finally has the gumption to be a suicide bomber against him, and more the choice to say, it's not actually necessary that I die, that I obliterate myself to do this.
Right.
There's
a death to self that's taking place, a letting go that's taking place.
And so that feels like just as much of a victory.
In a lot of ways, it's a more terrible death. It's like the death of the ego, the death of self-sufficiency, the death of the need to make things right yourself,
Yeah. And so it's quite amazing. I haven't seen a lot of contemporary Japanese movies, but I was just very impressed by that they came up with something this morally profound.
Yes.
and in a Godzilla
Right.
Godzilla movie.
Right.
There's one other thing I wanted to bring up, which is off that specific thematic topic, but it's something I thought of while we were having this conversation. In the original Godzilla from 1954, one of the big themes is this scientist being reluctant to kill Godzilla because he wants to study, Godzilla instead. And it's a little bit tedious, to be honest. In this movie, they pretty much drop that altogether, which I thought was interesting just because, nowadays in monster movies or movies about, horrible creatures or whatever, the tendency is always to have the sympathy for the devil, right? Like the sympathy for the monster and stuff. And so in the original one, we actually have much more of that sympathy for the monster, so to speak, than we do in this one. So I thought that would just like buck the trend in a nice way as well. Godzilla, we're not really thinking about Godzilla as like a precious species that must be preserved.
Well, but there is something interesting is that when they do finally defeat Godzilla at the end, everybody salutes sort of in the direction of Godzilla.
Oh, I just assumed they were saluting Koichi.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe so.
That was my assumption.
Yeah, I thought that there was an acknowledgement of like there has to be like a kind of reverence for like this force of nature,
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that was something that I liked about the first film in 1954 is the creature is so well done. It's like simultaneously horrific, but also it's got all this personality, and then at other times it's able to be kind of you can kind of there's almost like sympathy for it because its animalness is very clear. When it's sinking in the first film, you almost like feel bad for it. And I think that there's a little bit of that here, not maybe to the same extent in terms of, well, like what you've said, Thomas, like there's no problem sort of just everybody being clear that this thing is bad and it needs to be defeated.
Right.
But it's also, it represents, something like there's like a grandeur to Godzilla. I mean, think about the name, like Godzilla, it's like there's something almost kind of like there's like divine power.
I googled where the name Godzilla comes from.
Yeah,
it's Gojira in Japanese, and now I didn't read any articles, but so this is like the first text that Google came up with. But it said that it comes from like gorilla, like gorira. And the Japanese word for whale, which I forget what that is, but it ends in like
interesting.
So it's like a combination of those two whales, and it like indicates like the sort of like just the nature of this creature. It comes from the sea, but it's like a
gorilla whale.
Yeah. So
that's cool.
I don't know.
Well,
I don't know if God. I don't know if the notion of God is in the Japanese word at all, but it is in our.
Yes. And I think that it works. I think, and it's one of the reasons why it works. And I think that this analogy that's so readily able to be drawn because it's essentially a dragon movie, a dragon story. This analogy that's being able to be drawn with our own sort of. With just evil per se,
right?
Gives it a kind of staying power and a social relevancy. Even if you look at the way that the plan that they hatch in this most recent film for how to defeat him, it's kind of symbolically rich because they're going to use.
It makes more sense than the oxygen destroyer.
It does make more sense than the oxygen destroyer, but they're going to use like some sort of chemical to generate a ton of
Freon.
They're going to use Freon to basically, mess with the pressure, generate a lot of bubbles, and force Godzilla to sink at a rapid rate to the ocean floor.
Yeah,
and that the pressure, the quick change in pressure will be enough to kill him. And then their plan B is that if that doesn't work, then they're going to use these balls that inflate from the ocean floor to bring him back up really quickly, and it'll be the decompression that totally dysregulates him and kills him. And I just think that symbolically there's something to it. It's like the first attempt to defeat the dragon is to like push it down and to suppress it and keep it buried. And then it doesn't work. And now to defeat it, they have to pull it out. because they start bringing it up, and then Godzilla comes to, and he stops short of the surface, and he's like sort of halfway, and he's struggling to stay beneath. And what they have to do now, all these tugboats show up, they attach onto the battleships, and they're all trying to pull him out of the water. And to me, it's like this very rich metaphor for how these demons need to be brought out into the light. They need to be brought into, the truth and be defeated there,
Well,
so it's
that then it doesn't stop there, because Godzilla is still alive. He's not defeated when he's brought to the light, but that like the simple and very like profound sacrifice of one man, like one ordinary man, is what like ends up defeating him. That it's kind of like
totally.
Christ, like in a way,
yeah.
Koichi is sort of this like a Christ-like figure, and that he's like coming in, making the sacrifice to like save the masses. That like that's happening. But I think that's an interesting point with your analogy, and I love that. But that like it doesn't just end when we bring those demons to the light. Like Christ has to like enter into that with us in order for it to like really be transformed and like taken down. So that so that we can be redeemed. So that those things don't have to.
I mean, you could even get super granular about it, because he flies the plane with the bomb into Godzilla's mouth. So it's like, this is how the church fathers would read this. You have to like stop the mouth of Satan and his accusations against you. You need to silence him.
Yeah. Love that.
Another thing that I so appreciate about this film is that you could look at this, if you were just going to sort of give it a superficial, gloss and sort of just see it as part of a broader trend of just sort of churning up old intellectual property and like trying to nostalgia bait, make a new Star Wars or something. And I think we've talked enough about how this really isn't doing that, that it really is, it's still sort of has its own integrity. But also I think there's a funny argument to be made that Godzilla, it's almost like the proto Marvel Cinematic Universe, because there's been like there's like more than 30 Godzilla films that have been released over the years. Yeah. And they all sort of have something to do with each other. It's like Godzilla will like face one sort of like Mecha Godzilla or something, and then the two of them will have to band together to like fight another one.
The only Godzilla movie I had seen prior to this week was my family had a VHS of like Godzilla versus Megalon, and I think I saw that like once.
Right. But there's one called Destroy All Monsters, which just has all of the monsters from the various movies come together. And so it's almost like this kind of fan service formula that's very much being used by, Marvel and DC, like, oh, well now we'll have a movie where they're all in it, and so I just kind of like that this is somehow redeeming that formula too, that like, it's not that we can't sort of have iteration, we can't reiterate on established franchises or stories, but there's a way to do that has integrity, that is original, that, does something new while staying true to like certain values. And so I just think that this film is such a godsend for a lot of reasons. It's like, it's giving me hope in a lot of different things. Hope in Japan, hope in, entertainment cinema. Like this isn't art house fare. This is a movie that you should go see at the theaters. Not that anybody.
Oh yeah, we haven't even mentioned how we saw it, which is that we went to it was like RDX, right?
4DX.
4DX.
Yeah.
And so basically, yeah, you this was at the Regal Cinema in Times Square, and we like the seats move and like jostle you, and like you get sprayed with water and like hot air and stuff. And at first it actually worked pretty well. At first I was afraid it would be like a distraction from the visuals.
It was awesome. It was awesome.
We just figured like, okay, we're seeing a Godzilla movie. Like, when else are we gonna use this option?
Yeah, it was incredible. because it, like, I remember going to something like this, you know, at like a theme park as a kid or something, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, like they totally, the seats were just jerking you around and like vibrating, and then there was strobe lights when guns were fired, and then giant fans that would blow on you to give you the impression of like wind, and it was so sick. It was so sick.
You guys had a very different viewing experience than I did of this movie.
But you know, like, but this film succeeded in the way that I had already mentioned with respect to the first film, in that it ebbs and it flows. It has this really wonderful pacing where, you know, you have these big epic sequences of destruction and, you know, terror, and then like we enter into like the very human story where you're not being thrown around in your seat and there's no water being sprayed on you. But it was just so good because, you know, for as someone who you know, a long time ago got disillusioned with, you know, the movies that were coming out with superhero movies or with The Hobbit or, you know, Star Wars or whatever, you know, you feel kind of bummed out. You feel like, man, I like seeing movies too. Like, does every movie I have to watch have to be now, you know, like some movie on the Criterion Channel, you know? And and it's just nice to be reminded that no, like we can have just a movie that's like a lot of fun, but also is gonna make you want to live a better life. Like I literally walked away from that film like feeling the call to conversion in like a deep way, you know. Like, you know, one of the first things I did was like text my wife that I love her.
we promised that this podcast would not be about finding the deep Christian things in the latest superhero movie, but we never promised that it wouldn't be about finding the deep themes in the latest Godzilla movie.
Yes, there you go.
So,
I'm so glad
it's Japanese and in black and white, then we have like an excuse.
Yeah. No, yeah. Thank you, Erin, for being the
we would have had no idea that, you know, I could have believed that it was a fun movie, but I would have had no idea that this would be a movie that was like relevant to this podcast if you hadn't put it out. So
I know. Well, I tend to be pretty wary of like any new movies, especially like action movies. And so I was surprised even unto myself that this movie like floored me in the way that it did, and that it had these like very deep, rich themes. And yeah, and like James, like I was crying too at the end of it. I don't know, there's just something about all of it together, kind of like once you see these different like characters kind of over time, there's like this deeper conversion that each character has. It's like this whole cast of characters that are like forming this little patched together orphaned community of sorts, and all of them have their own like baggage and like weird stuff, and then all of them end up like ascending this like ladder of virtue or something, and then like there's that kind of final beautiful like heroic virtue courage moment that happens at the end that's like so life affirming and beautiful and like countercultural for what this like former kind of vision of like suicide being the higher form of like, if you've been dishonored, this is just what you do, like there's no mercy, no forgiveness. And so for me, like all of those things like hit me at once right at the end, and it just was so I think like this is a really needed movie right now actually, because it is like it's so deeply enmeshed in the culture. Like I think this is a movie that people generally are like, oh, Godzilla, cool, like yeah, nostalgia factor, like action factor, whatever, it's a cool Japanese movie with actual, you know, Japanese actors and the director, whatever, like there's all these cool qualities about it, and artistically it's beautiful, but it's kind of like a secret agent movie where like there are these really deep, beautiful themes related to virtue and the culture of life, and like how community kind of brings about that like deeper transformation of heart that brings about love and sacrifice in these really saintly, beautiful ways. So I just encourage like anyone listening to this podcast to give this movie a watch when it comes out, because it is, it's just transformative and wonderful, and
yeah.
I couldn't cry because my eyes were too dried by like the air blowing directly into my eyeballs. No, I did. I probably squeezed out a drop or two just for the voice.
Yeah. Well, you know, apparently it did have a very good theatrical run. So, last I checked, it had outstripped. It was now the third highest grossing foreign film in the United States in history. Number 2 is
and it's the highest grossing Godzilla movie.
Yeah, that's right. So number 2 is Life is Beautiful, and number 1 is Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. So it clearly had an impact in the States. And I hope that wasn't just because of nostalgia factor. I hope it was because of audiences really recognizing and responding to, here's an excellent film, an excellent story, with like deeply human themes.
Yeah.
And I, one can only hope that like Hollywood takes a cue too, because it's a film that shows like the beauty of the family. We have a lead character who's he's young, so he's got this sort of boyish quality, not unlike the main character in the first Godzilla film, but he's becoming a man, so there's like masculine virtues, fatherhood, self-sacrifice that are being called forth from him. And so it's exactly the kind of film that you would never expect Hollywood to make. And of course, Hollywood didn't make this, and so you would hope that it has
Unless it were like A Quiet Place, or
Yeah, right.
Like
yeah,
that.
well, you would hope that it would have some kind of impact. Yeah, A Quiet Place is a good film to mention in this context. Yeah. I also wanted to say that the film apparently didn't have a huge budget. So the last Godzilla film, I believe, was Godzilla versus King Kong. In 2021, and that had a budget of like 200 million, and this one nobody knows exactly, but it's somewhere between 10 and 15 billion. Million, sorry. 200 million, and then 10 and 15 million. My bad.
Yeah, wow.
So
that's a low budget, like indie, practically like an indie budget.
Basically. And the thing is, I think that it shows.
It's like a rom-com budget.
I think that it shows. I think that limitations are a good thing in art. Okay. I think that like when you're working within limitations, that tension generates good choices. And so, maybe as an aside, this is a reason to make more films in black and white, because that there's a limitation that might generate some good things. But here, I think, forced to do a Godzilla film on a lower budget, they had to find other things that were interesting. They didn't do the pitfall of like, okay, and now we're going to spend another 20 million on like this crazy action sequence, and then we're going to spend another 50 million on this crazy action sequence. Like it was very calculated and intentional, and and still a spectacle, still really impressive. So I think that there's just like so much that needs to be redeemed in Western film culture that this film can speak to,
Our friend Frank Yan, who is a listener of the podcast and a Catholic who works in the film world here in New York, he told me that Shin Godzilla from several years ago is equally good as this one. So I'd like to see that.
Yeah, Shin Godzilla. That's from 2016.
He said it was thematically quite different. Yeah, I think 2016.
Yeah, and I think it's part of the same like reboot that this is a part of.
Right.
So that would be interesting to check out. But yeah, I upon exiting the theater, I was completely prepared to just turn around and watch it again. I had so much fun with it. And was so moved by it. But then I didn't, because I really wanted to get home to my wife and children, That was like, that was, it was a great movie. Great movie.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Erin, thank you for coming on and suggesting the film. It was fun talking to you.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. This has been lovely, and appreciate it.
And if anybody wants to look you up, any of our listeners, is there somewhere they can go to see your artwork or Arthouse 2B?
Yeah, so in terms of my personal work, there's my website or Instagram. My website's erinkmcatee.com, or Instagram is also Erin K. McAtee. But probably
MCATEE.
Yeah, MCATEE. Thanks, Thomas. But probably, people can find me either through that or through Arthouse. But yeah, if they want to find out more about Arthouse as well, we have a website, Arthouse2B, which is the number 2 letter B.org. We also have an Instagram that's just at ArthouseTV. And so we share a lot about what we're up to, and also now we're a nonprofit organization, and so looking to sponsor a lot of really big dreams and a lot of artists this year to transform the culture here in the city. So if any listeners are interested, I'm just going to make a shameless plug. If you want to donate, you can find that on our website, and sharing this mission with us. We'd really appreciate it.
Awesome. Yes, thanks again, Erin. And thank you, listener. If you've made it this far, you really owe it to yourself to like and subscribe. You can also check us out over at catholicculture.org.
And I still don't know how they owe it to themselves.
Because they need to get our content. You know, they need.
But again, liking doesn't help them get our content.
Yes, it does, because it helps us in the algorithm, and so it helps us, you know, our longevity on YouTube. So, you owe it to me. How about that, Thomas? You owe me. You owe me, listener. I'm picking up my mic and telling you, you owe me.
It's less impressive when it's one of these tiny table mics than when it's like a giant mic with like a skull on the end of it from like a rock concert or something.
We really got to end this episode.
Bye.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Mike Aquilina, Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.